On Rusky Island, in the Sea of Japan, the Soviet Pacific Fleet faced an existential threat. Intelligence reports in 1934 confirmed their worst fears. Japan was abandoning naval treaties and rapidly building super battleships capable of striking Vladivostok from beyond the horizon. If Japan breached Rusky's massive cliffs, Vladivostok would fall, and Soviet Russia's entire presence in the east would collapse with it. To guard this passage, Soviet Russia needed something far more powerful, something like 900 tons of precision-engineered weaponry entombed within solid rock, operated by 50 men, and capable of hurling half-ton shells with pinpoint accuracy across 50 kilometers of open water. It was as if they were preparing to bury a battleship inside a mountain. Vladivostok, meaning to rule the east, lies 9,334 kilometers from Moscow, closer to Tokyo than to the Russian capital. Across the peninsula, an island loomed just off the coast. Once part of Qing China, it was ceded to Russia in 1860 under the Convention of Peking. The Russians wasted no time renaming it Rusky Island, Russian islander name that signaled they were there to stay. Historian Oleg Strativsky explained that the main objective was to prevent enemy ships from reaching Vladivostok and ensure the safe exit of Russian vessels, with the island itself acting as a natural shield. The first coastal batteries guarded only the entrance to Zolotoy Rog Bay. But by the 1890s, Japan had emerged as the greater threat. The Novosaltskaya Coastal Battery, number 375, was commissioned in 1888. Originally built from earth and timber, before being reinforced with stone and concrete, and completed in 1902, then, in the bitter winter of 1904, the Russo-Japanese War reached its boiling point. On February 8, the Japanese attacked the Russian fleet at Port Arthur, a vital base on China's coast. The assault severely damaged the battleships Tsarevich and Retvizin, as well as the cruiser Poltava. The attack developed into the Battle of Port Arthur, but the heavily fortified harbor kept the Japanese at bay. The Russian fleet had suffered, but its shore batteries and secure harbor maintained the advantage far to the east. Vladivostok stood as Russia's fortress on the Pacific. Key strategic point, the Japanese sought to neutralize. A cruiser squadron was dispatched to strike the city, but the mission quickly turned into a struggle against both the elements and Russian defenses. Temperatures plunged to -31 degrees Celsius, freezing the bay and choking the waters. With ice, Japanese ships, built for speed and maneuverability, became sluggish and vulnerable in the frozen sea. Navigation turned into a nightmare, forcing them to approach cautiously. Despite the bitter conditions, the squadron opened fire, hammering the city's eastern sector and targeting military workshops and incomplete fortifications in hopes of crippling Russian defenses. The bombardment caused damage, but the city remained defiant. Beyond the frozen bay lay Vladivostok's strongest defenses. The eastern Bosphorus, the strait separating Rusky Island from the mainland, was heavily mined and lined with shore batteries in treacherous waters. The Japanese hesitated. Advancing meant running a gauntlet of artillery fire with no guarantee of escape. They withdrew, having learned that Vladivostok was no easy prize. When the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed on September 5, 1905, Russia emerged humiliated. Port Arthur was lost. The Liaodong Peninsula and southern Sakhalin were stripped away, and Russia's influence in Manchuria was shattered. The sting of defeat was sharp, and commanders understood that Vladivostok was the last barrier between Japan and naval supremacy in the North Pacific. Losing it was not an option. Yet by 1906, the city's defenses were in poor shape. There were about 30 shore batteries, many of them makeshift, with outdated targeting systems and guns mounted on wooden platforms. Coordination was lacking, and the fortress was not ready for real war. The Russian Revolution of 1905 had paralyzed the empire, and uprisings in Vladivostok during October 1905 and January 1906 crippled both government and military efforts, making large-scale fortifications nearly impossible. But hesitation was dangerous. On April 16, 1907, Tsar Nicholas II declared Vladivostok a first-class fortress. ordering its defenses to be brought to full combat readiness. Engineers, strategists, and laborers transformed the rugged Pacific coastline into an impenetrable stronghold, concrete bastions, modern gun emplacements, and reinforced fortifications turned the city into the last great fortress of the Russian Far East. The plan was to create a vast, interconnected web of forts and batteries so that no enemy could focus on one point without exposing themselves to devastating counterattacks. 7 forts rose along the southern edge of the Amursadanka Valley, anchoring the landward defenses. Across the sea approaches, 4 more strongholds were built on Rusky Island, ensuring no fleet could threaten Vladivostok without enduring a storm of artillery fire. The terrain itself became part of the shield, with cliffs, ravines, and jagged coastlines isolating the city and making it nearly impregnable. By 1910, the blueprint was set and construction began. Roads were built along reverse slopes to hide them from enemy view, while underground telephone and telegraph lines ensured instant communication. Barbed wires stretched 4 kilometers, trenches were fortified, and powerful 120mm Vickers guns were installed in reinforced concrete bunkers designed to withstand relentless shelling. The scale was immense: over 200 kilometers of roads, tunnels, magazines, and firing positions carved into the landscape. Progress, however, was slow. World War I erupted in 1914, draining Russia's resources. Cement, steel, and labor were diverted to the Western Front, and Turkey's closure of the Dardanelles cut off access to the Mediterranean, choking supply lines. By 1916, 2/3 of the planned forts were complete, with others left unfinished. Even so, the fortress was already an engineering marvel. Beneath the surface lay an underground network of tunnels and barracks stretching 150 meters, reinforced with thick concrete and patterned paving. Soldiers could move unseen, emerging unexpectedly, while utilities could be repositioned without exposing crews to fire. The garrison had its own artesian well, electric power station, kitchens, and bakeries to sustain them during sieges. By 1916, however, the strategic importance of Vladivostok began to fade. A military convention signed with Japan eased tensions in the Pacific, and Moscow shifted its focus westward. Resources once destined for the fortress were redirected to Europe. Then came the Russian Revolution of 1917. The empire collapsed. The Tsarist regime fell, and the Bolsheviks seized power. But their control over the military was shaky by the end of 1917. Work on Vladivostok's fortress had ground to a halt. With no authority to maintain order, the site was looted. Military equipment, telegraph lines, and construction materials were stolen or repurposed. What had once been a formidable stronghold became a hollow relic of a forgotten strategy. Officially demilitarized in 1923 and abandoned by 1926, the ruins stood as silent witnesses to a vanished empire. For years, Vladivostok remained a military stronghold in name only. By the 1930s, the threat returned. Japan's expansionist ambitions loomed over Soviet territory, and Moscow took no chances. Vladivostok's defenses needed more than reinforcements, they needed a show of force. On Rusky Island, the Soviets began constructing the Voroshilov Battery, a fortress carved into Hizya text, rewritten as a continuous narrative without headings or bold wording, keeping the meaning intact and smoothing the flow. The most unusual decision came in 1934, when the Soviets, desperate for additional firepower, turned to an unlikely source. A decommissioned battleship, stripped of its former glory, would find a new purpose in the defenses of Vladivostok. The Poltava, a Gangut-class dreadnought, had been laid down in 1909 and launched in 1911 for the Russian Imperial Navy, a proud symbol of power and ambition. Measuring 180 meters along the waterline and 181.2 meters overall, with a beam of 26.9 meters and a draft of 9 meters, she was an imposing sight. Fully loaded, she displaced 24,800 tons, 1,500 more than planned, and rivaled the British Iron Duke and American Wyoming classes in scale. Built by the Franco-Russian Works, The Poltava was powered by 10 Parsons steam turbines, driving for propellers. Her engine rooms, located between turrets 3 and 4, housed both high and low-pressure turbines, capable of producing 42,000 shaft horsepower in design. Steam came from 25 Yarrow boilers burning a mix of coal and oil at a pressure of 17.5 atmospheres. With 1,847 tons of coal and 700 tons of fuel oil, she could sustain 10 knots for 3,500 nautical miles. During trials, she exceeded expectations, reaching 52,000 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 24.1 knots, faster than most British and American battleships of the time. Her armament was equally formidable. She carried 12 305mm pattern 1907 guns in 4 triple turrets, massive weapons with a range of up to 22,000 meters. Their breech-loading design allowed faster reloads and a choice between high-explosive and armor-piercing shells. Unlike many battleships, the Poltava avoided superfiring turrets, reducing muzzle blast effects and increasing survivability. 4. Close-range defense. She mounted 16 119mm casemate guns, a single 76mm anti-aircraft gun, and 4 torpedo tubes with 12 torpedoes. Despite her potential, the Poltava saw little action during World War I, serving more as a symbol of naval power. After the Russian Revolution, she was sidelined, and in November 1919, a fire ravaged her forward boiler room, leaving much of her interior gutted. By the mid-1920s, she was abandoned as a hulk, her guns silent, and was gradually stripped for parts to keep her sister ships operational. Plans to restore or convert her never materialized. In the 1930s, as Japan's naval strength grew, the Soviet Union reconsidered her value. Plans to reinforce Vladivostok's coastal defenses were already underway, but the proposed 180mm guns were deemed insufficient against Japanese battleships. The dormant Poltava offered a solution. In 1934, the Soviet government decided to extract her massive 305mm turrets and install them as stationary coastal artillery on Rusky Island, forming the Voroshilov Battery. Built between 1932 and 1934, the battery mounted 2 of Poltava's original guns high in Rusky Island's rugged mountains. Buried 5.5 meters underground and reinforced by terraces, the guns formed a nearly indestructible defensive position. Roads were carved to move ammunition directly to the gun sites, and a targeting station 1.5 kilometers away could detect and track targets up to 50 kilometers out. Once data such as elevation and traverse angles were calculated, it was transmitted to the crews, enabling pinpoint accuracy. The turrets could be powered electrically or, if needed, rotated manually by 10 men. The combination of mechanical reliability and electrical efficiency made them remarkable for the time. Military expert Vladimir Grebin noted that the crews required nothing beyond the targeting information to operate effectively. The psychological effect of the battery was enormous. Japan, aware of its firepower and security, hesitated to risk an invasion during World War II. The guns fired only once in 1939. In a practice round, a symbolic display of readiness that made their silence their greatest weapon. Historian Nikolai Plato described it as a fortress that never had to fight because its deterrent power was enough to keep the enemy away. For decades, the guns of the Poltava stood guard over the Pacific, their barrels fixed on the horizon. Officially decommissioned as a battleship in 1940, her structure was later converted into a floating base for small ships during the siege of Leningrad. By 1944, she had been raised and towed to Leningrad, and after the war, her remains were dismantled for parts and reused for defense purposes. 2 of her turrets were reinstalled at Coast Defense Battery 30 in Sevastopol, where they stood until 1997. After the fall of the Soviet Union, the fortress began to decay, but the guns of the Poltava remained in place. The Voroshilov Battery, decommissioned in 1997, became part of the Military and History Pacific Fleet Museum. Today, its exhibit on Rusky Island displays maps, portraits, and photographs from its construction. preserving the memory of a defensive system that combined massive naval firepower with the protective strength of a mountain, and that succeeded through deterrence rather than battle.